Welcome to the Transforming Trauma Podcast, a complex trauma podcast through the NARM Training Institute. My name is Sarah Buino, and I'm so excited to be sharing today's interview with you. The NARM Training Institute has a very special announcement. Thanks to all your interest in learning more about NARM, we're launching the online NARM Basics Training, an online training for transforming trauma. This new Level 1 training in the NeuroAffective Relational Model is for professionals working with complex trauma. The intention of this online training is to make it more accessible to learn NARM. We know that during this time of COVID-19, live professional trainings are just not an option. But even before this global crisis, many of you told us that you had difficulties traveling to come learn NARM, getting time off work, or affording the full NARM Practitioner Training. Despite these obstacles, many of you still wanted to learn NARM. If this rings true, then this online training is for you. This professional training is designed to support those of you working with clients or populations dealing with complex trauma, which with COVID in its aftermath includes many of us. This training is for mental health professionals, as well as helping professionals such as nurses, doctors, other healthcare providers, educators, substance abuse counselors, coaches, body workers, and more. Participants will learn more about the changing field of trauma, a deeper understanding of the impacts of adverse childhood experiences and complex post-traumatic stress disorder, and how NARM, one of the first models specifically designed to address C-PTSD, can support professionals in the growing trauma-informed field. The online basics training will be taught by NARM creator Dr. Lawrence Heller, NARM senior faculty members Brad Kammer and Stephanie Klein, and a team of experienced NARM trainers. During the 4-month online training, they will explore the complex themes like difference between shock trauma and developmental trauma, working with guilt, shame, and self-sabotage, the impact of complex trauma on relationships, families, and children, vicarious trauma and practitioner burnout, post-traumatic growth, and finally, how to apply NARM principles in a variety of settings. If you're looking for more advanced training in attachment, relational, developmental, and intergenerational trauma, and are working in healthcare, education, substance abuse recovery, or allied fields, join us for this Level 1 NARM training to become a NARM-informed professional. The next online NARM Basics training is starting in November 2020 and will run 1 weekend a month through February of 2021. 60 continuing education units will be available for most helping professionals. Register now to reserve your spot. For more information and to apply to the online NARM Basics training, please visit www.narmtraining.com/online-basics. Join us in learning how to transform trauma. And now on to my interview with today's guest, Jenny Winkel. Jenny is a NARM practitioner with a special interest in religious trauma, a somatic experiencing practitioner, a licensed massage therapist, and owner of Salt City Bodyworks. She received her master's degree in somatic depth psychology from Pacifica Graduate Institute in Santa Barbara, California. Jenny is a mom of 2 boys and a recent convert to reformer Pilates and finds meaning in a well-crafted cup of coffee. So please enjoy my interview with Jenny Winkel. Hello, Jenny. Welcome to Transforming Trauma.
Hi, Sarah.
Thanks so much for joining us today. As we were getting ready for this and talking through a couple things, I was getting all excited to hear more information. So I'm really excited to talk to you today.
Well, good. I'm excited to be here. Thank you for having me.
Yeah. So we always like to start Transforming Trauma by asking what you hope listeners will get out of the interview today.
Well, I've been thinking about this a lot, and I think I want our listeners to know that NARM is not a protocol. It's a relational model. And the reason why that's important to know is because humans are designed to heal in relationship.
Mm-hmm.
I think we've all had the experience of being in therapy or some kind of corrective program and having that sense of being objectified.
Yeah.
And it feels horrible. So the fact that NARM is a relational model, for me, has been really pivotal. It's been I think it makes all the difference. I would like for our listeners to know that because it is so relational, that when they're considering working with a NARM therapist or practitioner, that they should check out and see if a consult is available. And that way they can meet their therapist or practitioner ahead of time before they schedule any session to see if there's chemistry or if they have a vibe with them. Because more than any kind of particular skill or intervention the therapist might have is that chemistry in the relationship. So there's a pro tip from the inside to all our listeners.
Yep. Pro tip, hashtag pro tip.
The other thing is today we'll be talking about religious trauma, and I think it's probably helpful to set up a couple of things up front to be clear on what we're talking about, what we're not talking about. We're talking specifically about what some people call religious trauma syndrome. Some people call it shattered faith syndrome. And that's different from religious abuse, though not totally unrelated. And it's different because these syndromes come from people who have been born and or raised in fundamentalist religious communities. So we'll be talking in the interview about the ways that the human development is impacted by fundamentalism and in not very healthy ways. And people will grow up and their neural wiring happens in this soup. And then if they come to a point where they decide to leave that system, then there's this additional, it's really crisis, really is what it is, leaving on the other side back into this world that you were never trained or raised to live in and navigate very well. So religious abuse happens, it can happen within that system, but it can also happen outside of fundamentalism as well. So that would be, abuse of power. And of course, there's so much, how should we say, like notoriety over sexual abuse within religious systems. Yeah. So they are different, though not totally unrelated. So what we're talking about today is the syndromes that come, the traumatic syndromes that come out of being raised in a fundamentalist community.
Yeah. Tell us a little bit more about who you are and where you're working right now.
Well, I live just outside of Salt Lake City, Utah, in a city called Sandy. And our listeners won't care about this, but it's called Sandy because prehistorically, this whole area was an ocean. And so the earth is still pretty sandy from Lake Bonneville. That's just between you and us. That's a little tidbit native to my area. I grew up in Northern California in the redwoods of Humboldt County. So I came out to Utah to go to school, and I've been here ever since, probably about 30 years. Yeah. And I work with people on the spectrum of all sorts of trauma, mostly developmental and relational trauma. I do some shock trauma. And my clientele includes people that do have religious or spiritual trauma, but people who are actively religious as well that have developmental trauma, and people who may be somewhere in between that are trying to kind of figure out their relationship with God after having a traumatic experience, wanting to renegotiate that. And I think that brings me to a point too, which I would like for our listeners to know, which is part of the reason that NARM is so well suited to work with religious trauma is because it's a model that works well with complexity. And religious trauma is very complex. There are ways in which religious observance is very healthy.
And can be a protective factor.
Thank you for pointing that out. Yeah.
It is actually to people getting sober. There's a correlation with engaging in religious practice and maintaining recovery.
You know what? I didn't know that.
Hashtag pro tip.
You know what? That's very interesting, Sarah, because when I had my faith crisis about 10 years ago, I actually joined Alcoholics Anonymous and I went for a few years, which was probably the biggest paradox ever because I was a person who had never tasted alcohol in my life. And here I was showing up to these meetings because I was wanting a way to renegotiate my relationship with God.
Wow.
Or a higher power, or to come to a place of maybe realizing that I didn't believe in one or whatever. But I knew it was a community that couldn't kick me out. I could always keep coming back.
Right.
And yeah.
That's awesome.
It was really instrumental actually on my healing path. So I'm glad you're pointing that out, that yes, religious observance can absolutely be very healthy and very supportive. Some of my clients with developmental trauma who were raised in the same faith tradition that I was, they had these very hostile home environments or dangerous home environments. And their religion and their religious community was a very stabilizing, nurturing place, an organizing place for them. So I think I just want to point out that even inside of fundamentalism, there's a wide variety of ways that people relate to it. and are affected by it and internalize it or not.
Mm-hmm.
So that's part of all the complexity.
Right. And you've talked a little bit about, I don't know that I'm very clear yet on the difference between religious trauma syndrome and religious abuse. And I'm assuming that the way that we define that really dictates the way that you work with clients experiencing that. So can you break it down into kind of almost like a soundbite version of defining those two things?
Let me give it my best shot.
Yeah.
Okay. Religious trauma syndrome is exclusive to fundamentalism.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
So being born into and or raised inside a fundamentalist community or religious structure affects your human development, affects the way you see yourself in relationship to the world. It affects your identity, why you believe you're here on this planet and where you're going afterwards. I mean, it's really so much for the soundbite. Sorry, Sarah.
Well, these are not simple concepts, so I'm not surprised that it takes more words. Yeah.
So really what it is, and I don't know if this is too extreme to say, but fundamentalist religious indoctrination can be one of the most comprehensive forms of an internal colonization that I know of. Yeah.
Internal colonization. I'm assuming that's essentially taking over one's internal workings. Is that generally what that means? Because that felt like when you said that, I just kind of felt this like deep reverberation internally.
Yeah. That's what it is.
So then to contrast, religious abuse is essentially, quote unquote, any abuse that may happen that's not necessarily under the fundamental umbrella.
I would say so. And this is one reason why this is hard for me to delineate, is because I don't have a frame of reference for religious observance outside of fundamentalist paradigm. So I know that there are people who were raised in homes where they went to church maybe for Easter or Christmas, or went even once a week, but their congregations were very liberal and very accepting and very come when you want and not when you don't. And so it doesn't have the same effect on their human development, on their interiority. And so within those relationships, there can be a religious abuse, where particularly sexual abuse, and that's very well known, but even just abuse of power, where, the people in power can reinforce these ideas of worthiness.
Yeah.
Instill shame, guilt. Yeah. So that kind of thing I would put in the form of religious abuse. And that can happen outside, both outside and inside a fundamentalist structure. So that's not a soundbite, but does that help delineate?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay.
And I was going to say, identify as a person who suffered from, I would call it spiritual abuse, I guess. And it wasn't the church itself, but it was the way that my mother used the teachings of Jesus to control, to shame, the guilt, manipulation, all of that. Yeah.
I think you just summarized it. And I'm glad you pointed it out, that it's not always the hierarchy in the church structure. It can be parents or caregivers at home that are really instilling that. So yeah, I think you summarized it really well.
Let's back up before we get to some details of some stories. What led you specifically to NARM?
In my previous career life, I was a professional photographer.
Oh, wow.
Interestingly enough, I look back and I realized that was a way that I used to see people. I was very curious about people because that's all I really love to photograph. And I was a photographer in high school, but high school also was the place where I first experienced massage therapy and body work. And that really stuck with me. I went to the university, got my degree in photography. And at the end of the 4 years, I decided I was going to do massage therapy as well to become a licensed therapist. And I started a program and actually didn't finish it because I got married, had kids, and kind of life swept me away. So it was really in my midlife crisis, which was my faith crisis, my faith transition, that I came back around to it. And I finished massage therapy school and worked a few years in the fields with people. I love doing deep tissue and injury rehab. And people would come in and say, I feel this pain here, I feel it there. And a lot of times it's pretty straightforward. But a lot of times I could not find the pain they were talking about. I knew it was there, but I couldn't trace it back to any particular location in the tissue. So it started getting me to consider, where is this pain coming from? So that led me to a somatics program at Pacifica Graduate Institute in Santa Barbara. And it was a master's program in depth psychology with an emphasis in somatics.
Wow, that's awesome.
Yeah, it was super lush. I mean, you know what? I went to graduate school because I was really bent on getting all these scientific reasons as to, why is this pain in the body and da 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 da. But Pacifica, as you know, is a pretty, depth psychology, right? You can go all over the place with that. And so I left my program with more questions than I had when I came in, which is actually a really great place to be. Like,
exactly. It really is.
Yes, all this curiosity and wonder in me. But that's where I found Peter Levine and somatic experiencing. And that did answer a lot of my specific questions on how does that pain get stored and trapped in there, and learning about trauma physiology and activation that doesn't get discharged, and muscle contraction that doesn't get completed in the fight or flight responses. So I got really, really excited about that. And I was continuing doing massage therapy in the meantime, and decided I wanted to become a somatic experiencing practitioner. So I did that and was using that with clients coming to me with complex trauma. So by now, my private practice, I've divided into, I was still doing traditional body work and massage therapy, but then also starting to see clients with the trauma history. And I was feeling confused because the somatic experiencing interventions weren't working that well with my clients with complex trauma. And I was doing a case consult one day with Brad Kammer, and he said, and I had heard about NARM before that, but I didn't know that much. He said, Jenny, you may want to look into this and see if it's something that you'd like to study and certify. And he was right. So I did. I went and trained in Austin in 2018 and finished last year. And I love it. Love, love, love it. It just filled in all the gaps with my complex trauma clients. And not just with my clients, Sarah, but I honestly myself have experienced. Yeah, as practitioners, sometimes we have this imposter syndrome. When I'm teaching people these things, I'm working with these principles, but I myself feel still kind of hung up in these particular areas. And NARM really got into those areas for me. And it's really liberating is really, how I can describe it.
Wonderful. And I don't know, this question is almost kind of too big to answer, but let's see where you take it. How do you use NARM with your clients who have suffered religious trauma?
Well, you want to know the truth is I use it the same as I use it with all my other clients, because NARM is a model that works with attachment and relational trauma. And when we're talking about attachment, we're talking about the ways that a newborn human being bonds with its caregivers, and then subsequently begins to develop its identity and grow into an autonomous human being. And those initial stages of human development, they're very vulnerable. We as little humans rely exclusively on our caregiving system to protect us, and we rely on it for survival. We rely on it to teach us who we are and instill in us the confidence and the capacity to become an autonomous, contributing, wonderful, lovely human being that can bring our gifts into the world. And fundamentalist religion is a direct extension of the caregiving system, of those attachment relationships.
Right. I imagine in my limited research on fundamentalism and the way that's expressed in different religions is it really takes away your freedom. It takes away your autonomy and agency in order to control, right?
I think you said it really well.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And that's why it does so much harm on human development, because it's not focused on the unique unfolding of the individual. It's demanding compliance, conformity, and the greater good is not the unique individual, but the collective.
Right. And with NARM, I'm kind of picturing a client session. And one of the things that I've found as a NARM student and then utilizing NARM as a practitioner and actually, in myself as a receiver of NARM therapy, that the greater the shame internally, the greater a push away from agency. I can find myself, and even right now with everything going on with COVID, where I know I want to practice self-compassion. I want to do these things to be kind to myself. And yet there's a part of me that pushes that agency away because it's just so much more comfortable and familiar to stay in a non-agency state. And I only imagine that for people suffering from religious trauma syndrome, that push away of agency is probably so strong for them. Is that what you see?
I love everything that you just said. And I think that's what I really, really do, because I think that most of us professionals and listeners alike, can identify with exactly what you just said. That there's a part of us that resists agency, or this, when we say agency, how I understand it is connecting to my power inside to choose and to be the one that's navigating, or at least for the most part, navigating my life. And that's dangerous, right? On a lot of levels, it feels dangerous. And there's a part of, I think, all humans that really does want to settle back into a place of, how about if I just have somebody else tell me what to do? Or I'll read a book, or I'll listen to a podcast, or I'll get some inspiration somewhere, and that will tell me what to do. And it's seductive. I think there's a certain amount of comfort in that. It's something a lot of us are familiar with, especially in fundamentalism. There is an allure and perceived sense of security in having somebody else, especially if you perceive them as having power and authority, tell you the right thing to do. It can be very activating, actually, connecting to your own agency and expanding and moving forward that way. So yes to what you said.
So yes to all of it. Yeah. And you've alluded to your own crisis of, how did you put it?
Yeah, I think I said faith crisis.
Faith crisis.
Also, faith transition is another term that's familiar to people leaving fundamentalism. Yeah.
Would you be willing to share a little bit more of that story?
Yes. When I listened to the podcast interview you did with Wangui, the psychotherapist in Kenya, she said something that really moved me. Well, she said a lot of things that really moved me, but, she pointed out this little voice in us. It's our soul speaking, that's protesting and saying, this isn't right. This isn't feeding me. This isn't resonating with me. This is stifling me. And I had been born and raised in my previous faith tradition. It was when I was about 35, actually, that I left. But for years previous to that, I had that gnawing sensation inside. But it was terrifying to think of leaving. And I don't know that I wanted to leave either. Yeah. And so it was, and here I might pause to point out too, that one important concept to consider while working with religious trauma is the religious paradox, that a fundamentalist religious community is simultaneously a place of comfort and refuge and community and love and terror. And that is the same as the biological paradox, or the attachment, right? That our family systems represent the same. So I think I rode that wave. Well, I know I rode that wave for years and years and years, that it still was this place of home and people that I loved and that I knew loved me. Right. While also at the same time increasingly becoming a place at which I couldn't resonate completely and in significant ways, particularly in fundamentalist communities. There's gender inequality and they're not typically places that are accepting and safe for LGBTQ people either.
I actually did an interview recently on my other podcast with a man who suffered from not only religious abuse in a fundamentalist religion for being gay, but then he went to a therapist who was part of the religion, who then I'm blanking on what they call that right now, but conversion therapy, attempting to convert him. And man, the things that he told me were just heartbreaking.
Heartbreaking is the word.
Yeah.
Yeah, it really is. It epitomizes that dynamic of trying to get the unique individual in the system to become something that they're not, trying to push down their unique beauty and trying to make them conform in sometimes these violent ways like conversion therapy is.
Yeah.
So let's see if I can backtrack to your question. Back to
your story.
My crisis.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So I think it was pressure building and building over time. And I realized that in the end, it was coming down to whether or not I wanted to embark on a path. Well, Carl Jung calls it individuation, right? Where you leave the fold and you begin to explore who you are and expand that territory, or, stay, this is what you were talking about earlier, stay inside that kind of comfortable place, comfortable, but increasingly not comfortable, right? I mean, it was a big dilemma. So in the end, I did leave, and I'm talking about it now 10 years later, and also with the benefit of a lot of work in NARM. And so I might sound calm and like, oh, this happened also seamlessly and peacefully, but it was like the biggest crisis of my life. Incredibly painful, incredibly isolating and confusing. And it didn't just happen inside of a couple of months. It happened over years.
And I just want to throw in here too, because you've related this to the attachment relationship with our caregivers. And I think this is a really great example of trying to protect in order to be able to still get the good things out of the fundamentalist community. You have to essentially protect that and therefore judge and blame the self instead of blaming the environment, just like we do with our family of origin, right?
Can you just say that one more time, or at least
I don't know.
We edit the podcast, like put it in 2 times or more?
What did I say? So
protecting the attachment relationship.
Yeah. If we look at the religious community as the family, which it is.
It is. Absolutely it is.
Yeah. And we protect that relationship at all cost to ourselves, cost to our connection with ourselves.
Amen. If you don't mind me using
no
that
pun
word.
Intended.
And that is so painful. And that, again, just going back to your podcast interview with Wangowi, and she asked that question, what is it that we are protecting that is worth the pain of losing oneself?
Right.
And the answer is those attachment relationships. And it is incredibly confusing because these are, like I said, these are people, not all of them, right? But there are people that I had deep, meaningful relationships with, not just in my congregation, but in my family, right? My family of origin, my extended family. And so this is one reason I think it's difficult to talk about religious trauma syndrome, is because you're in mixed company. Right. So it's difficult to bring up the pain and the alienation and the heartbreak among people who are still well connected and for whom that system still serves, and not have it feel divisive or polarized.
I feel like there's a lot of gaslighting that can happen with that because fundamentalism at its core wants things to be black and white. And so what a person who's leaving is essentially asking a family member to hold is that it's not black and white, and that there are things that were hurtful to you, even though they weren't harmful to that person, right?
I think you said it so well. I really do. Yeah. And furthermore, in fundamentalism, the hierarchy, the system of power is always right. Right. So then if I have a disagreement or a confusion, then it's because something's wrong with me, or I'm not asking in the right way, And so there is a certain amount of gaslighting. And if you stay inside that closed system, it's very difficult.
Yeah. And it's interesting. energetically and in my body resonating with this so much, even though I haven't had the same experience. I think any flavor of religious or spiritual abuse, you at least have that taste in your mouth, right? And I think that's what I'm really picking up on right now. As you're telling this story, I'm getting this image of you at the edge of a cliff. And I'm guessing that the jump off the cliff was really scary. And when your parachute opened, there was still some fear that it wasn't going to take you safely to the ground. I'm just so curious at that moment. I mean, I'm sure there's not one moment, but I'm guessing that there was a pretty dramatic experience of, no, I really have to get out of this. And I'm curious how you turned that corner.
Oh, these are really great questions. Yeah, I'm going to pause a moment to think.
Sit with it. Yeah.
Yeah. I would say that the pressure built up so much over time that, looking back, I wish I could say that there was this graceful, peaceful, equanimous exit. I mean, that would have been a nice narrative, but that's not how it was. The pressure was so intense at the end that it was a very messy, painful exit. And I do remember the initial period of time where I wasn't going to church on Sunday and how confusing and weird that felt, and the fear that I felt too of people wondering and maybe asking questions and challenging me. And I was married with 2 little children at the time too. And so there was this confusion of like, well, how do I continue to raise them? Because I had been raising them in that tradition as well. And here's another thing that is really worth pointing out that NARM does so well is to hold all sides of the complexity. And when you work with a wise and seasoned therapist or practitioner, you can feel that in them, that they're not taking sides, that they're helping you navigate that interiority. And I really, really wish that I had a NARM therapist at the time who could hold that place for me. It was partly why I wanted to come onto this podcast, to be able to let people know who are going through their faith crisis now that this is available. Because it's not like at the time, when I was jumping off the cliff, to use your metaphor, that there weren't support groups for ex-fundamentalists and particularly those of my former faith. But I started to say I was scared to go. And then I was like, no, I don't want to tell people that I was scared, but I'll just be honest. I was scared to go because there's understandably a lot of anger and rage in some of those ex-communities. And that was too much for my system to handle because of how you describe so well the parts of us that still want to protect the relationship. I couldn't do it. I couldn't go and be amidst all of that anger and criticism and outrage. Again, all of it totally justifiable, but there were still parts of me that were connected and attached to that system.
Can I jump in here too? Because I think this is a great place to highlight. In NARM, we talk about default versus primary emotions. And I too really relate to not being able to tolerate outrage. And I think outrage and anger are different. And if I'm kind of like feeling into it, I wonder if outrage is essentially the default emotion, the one that we go to more quickly, the one that's most accessible, and then the primary emotion being grief. So I'm curious for you in this process, as you're looking back, do you recognize that you needed to feel grief, anger, both of those things in order to move through, to transform this trauma, if you will?
Your question makes me reflect on that time period for like to see exactly how that was for me. And I would say, Sarah, that so many of those years I was in freeze, deep freeze.
Makes sense. When it's not safe to move.
And it did not feel safe at all. And so I was in freeze for years. And really, it wasn't until very recently, I would say even just the past year, that I've been able to reach those parts of me that hold the deep grief for the loss.
Yeah.
And also, one thing I didn't realize was affecting me so much all of those years that I was able to connect to recently is feeling that nobody cared that I left.
Oof.
That I had Yeah.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying that was the case. I was saying that that was my inside experience, that I had given, 1000% of my life to my former faith and so many years of church service and dedication. And it's not a once a week Sunday event. It's every day. It's every moment of the day. And I felt like I gave my life to it. And then when I left, it just kept going on without me, that there was no noticeable difference. I think that was maybe so painful at the time that I couldn't even connect with it until just recently, when it felt safe enough to do so.
And how many years since you left?
10.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you for saying that, because I think as a therapist, sometimes we can want to jump in and rush the healing process for our clients. And so just to know that it took 10 years for you to thaw out of that freeze in order to access those emotions. And so that really is a good reminder for me as a therapist to chill. Chill. It's not my process.
And even you just reflecting that to me right now actually helps me to put it into perspective, because yeah, I'm in the soup. It's hard for me sometimes to have, that. So I thank you for pointing that out. It's so critical. It's such a tender process, and it does take time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, thank you so much for sharing the personal part of this. This just felt really important. And I think this is going to be really resonant for a lot of folk. So thank you for sharing that personally. If we can transition back to your work with clients, I'm curious if there's any particular story of strength or struggle that you want to share with us.
Yeah. And I did talk with my clients ahead of time to make sure it was okay that I shared these stories, and of course, leaving their identity anonymous. One is a story with a client who was raised in a deeply, it's the fundamentalist community. And again, like, we're talking this spectrum of a fundamentalism. Earlier, before we recorded, I mentioned to you that Judith Herman, who was the first to name complex PTSD, she had outlined in her book, Trauma and Recovery, the criteria for that. And even though it's still not a diagnosis, we talk about it like it is, because it soon will be. But her first requirement was that a person have a history of subjection to totalitarian control over a prolonged period. And some examples she gives are people who have survived religious cults. And a cult, like we think about, like Jim Jones or David Koresh, that's on a far end, but there is still the rest of the spectrum to consider. And I would say that this client in particular was on one of the farther ends of that spectrum and suffered a lot in leaving her community. And she came to me after having been on a journey of years of physical health, of trying to figure out what was going on with her physical health. And she finally came to an understanding, just from her own research, that at the root of it was attachment and relational trauma. So she discovered NARM and then looked up in the state what therapists there are, and there aren't very many.
I know. We're working on it. That's part of the point of the podcast. Come to us, friends. Come join us.
Please. I think I'm one of two that I know of in all of Utah. Yeah. So she reached out to me, and we started sessions. And her physical appearance when she came really impressed me, because she's a very lovely young lady, and I could tell she had been through a lot, and her face was somewhat drawn, and I could tell she was holding a lot of fear and anxiety. And she talked to me about the journey through traditional medicine and non-traditional medicine, trying to get better. So we started on the sessions, and it quickly became apparent that because she was born into a family of many, many children, that a lot of what she experienced as a child was neglect, which is not a word that it's a tricky word, right? Because sometimes we think of neglect as like, oh, it's a parent who doesn't care, who just is like skipping out at night to go to parties and leaving the baby in the crib. But neglect happens a lot in fundamentalist communities because of the number of children that tend to be born into one family.
Ooh, I didn't think about that. Yeah.
Yeah. So this happened to be the case with her, and a lot of her physical issues were indeed stemming from this just a lack of bonding and attachment with her mother, and then also subsequent loss of self in this system that demands conformity and it's very rigid and exacting. I think what I'm trying to get at is that she already was really ripe and ready. I think she was at the cusp of transformation already. And the next session she came, I could tell a physical difference in her appearance. And I asked her about it, and she said she could too, that there was more light in her face. And she told me just in a week, she was already experiencing a dramatic decrease of her physical symptoms. And the next session she came in, it was more of the same, that more light in her face, and she seemed more relaxed and at ease in her body. And we kept commenting on it. And she was so delighted and so grateful. And these are her words, right? That the NARM process is allowing her, because we still have a professional relationship, is allowing her to figure out on her own how to find herself and how to connect with what is true for her. And regularly in our sessions, I feel myself, I'm so moved and I get emotional, listening to her, for the courage that she's had to draw on her path and not giving up on herself and confronting the beliefs and the internalizations that she was raised with and challenging them, because she can feel that they're not resonant or right in her body, but then in her mind, those neural loops are still firing, right? So NARM is a beautiful model of disidentification, whether you're working with religious trauma or not. And so it's helping her be able to see what parts of her were introduced externally and what parts are native to the interior terrain. And it's so lovely watching her. And it's a process of liberation is really what it is. And it's having a direct impact on her physical health as well.
Wow.
She told me after a few sessions, she came in, she said, I want you to know that before, and I realized too, let me take a step to the side to say that, this is a dramatic case, like what you and I were talking about earlier. Normally, trauma recovery is a very delicate, slow process over time, as it should be. So I don't want to convey the idea that this is like standard or typical, but nonetheless, it's real and it's happening. And she came in after a few sessions and she said, I didn't want to die, but I just felt my physical health was getting so bad that I just felt the life going out of me. Yeah. And I felt that I was at that point where I just didn't know what else to do before I found NARM. And now I am feeling more and more alive than ever, and glad to be alive.
Mm-hmm. And that's exactly the hope in NARM, is to reconnect us to our sense of aliveness that was lost. Wow.
I like how you said that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think it's probably a good place to start winding down. And I'm just reflecting on your initial intention of really helping people understand the experience of someone who's experienced religious trauma or religious abuse. And I think you nailed it.
Well, I have really loved being here and connecting with you, and for the safety that you create and in these conversations. And this is going to sound like a shameless plug for the other episodes, but I've been really devouring them.
Oh, good.
Waiting for each new one to come out. So thank you so much for what you're doing and for bringing this out into the world. It's so, so valuable.
Oh, thank you. It's a pleasure. It's fun. I love talking to people.
I can tell.
Yeah.
Thanks, Sarah.
Is there anything else, any final words you'd like to share with listeners today?
I don't think so. I think we covered everything.
We're complete.
I think so.
Wonderful. Well, thank you again for being here. This was really a particularly fascinating one for me, so I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks so much for joining us for today's episode. If you want to learn more, you can check out the show notes or visit us at www.narmtraining.com/transformingtrauma. Please join us for our online NARM training in learning how to transform trauma. This online NARM basics training is available for professionals working with clients or populations dealing with complex trauma. Join us for this level 1 NARM training to become a NARM-informed professional. For more information and to apply, please visit at www.narmtraining.com/online basics. Thanks to Andrea Klunder and the Creative Imposter Studios for producing and editing, to Tori Essex for our album art, and to Brad Kammer for the creation of this podcast. We really look forward to building community and connection with you and changing the world by transforming trauma.